He rode on a gray horse the color of bad weather, and Harlan's Creek made up its mind about him before he reached the hitching post. That was Martha Gale's first thought when she saw him come up the main road from her second-floor window. Not the thought she was proud of, but the honest one. Not running, not hurrying, just riding with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who had learned not to arrive anywhere like he needed something from it. He was older than a drifter usually looked, mid-30s maybe, though the road had a way of adding years that the calendar hadn't earned yet. His coat was military surplus, faded to a gray-green that matched nothing in particular and everything about the Montana landscape in late summer. His hat was pulled low. His horse moved like it trusted him, which Martha had always thought was the most reliable character reference a man could carry. She watched him from the window above the front desk of the Gale boarding house, her hand still holding the ledger she'd stopped reading 3 minutes ago without noticing. Below her on the street, she could already see it happening. The two men outside the feed store had stopped talking. The boys sweeping the saloon steps had gone still. Even old Ren Fogarty, who was famously indifferent to everything that didn't directly involve his horses, had turned from his fence post to look. Harlan's Creek was watching. It had gotten very good at watching strangers. The town sat at the foot of the Bitterroot Range in southern Montana, 340 souls and one main street that managed, in the right light, to look almost prosperous. There was a bank, a saloon, a general store, a church that held services every Sunday and gossip every other day of the week. There were cattle ranches spreading out from the valley in 3 directions. Families that had been here long enough to stop thinking of themselves as settlers and start thinking of themselves as the land itself. It was, by most measures, a town that worked. 6 weeks ago, it had stopped working quite right. A farmhand named Cole Dre had been found dead in a ditch off the Miller Road on a Tuesday morning in July, and nobody had been arrested, and nobody could say with certainty why. And that uncertainty had settled over Harlan's Creek the way smoke settles in a low valley, slowly, completely, until you couldn't remember what the air had smelled like before. Then the cattle thefts had started. 3 ranches in 2 months. Small numbers each time, but enough to make every man in the valley start counting his herd twice and looking at his neighbors with new and uncomfortable attention. Fear had moved into Harlan's Creek and begun rearranging the furniture. It had not improved the decor. So when a stranger rode in on a gray horse with military coat and no particular explanation for himself, the town did what frightened towns do. It decided things in advance. Martha watched him tie his horse to the rail in front of the saloon and go in, and she watched the subtle repositioning of people on the street that followed. The way a crowd that isn't quite a crowd begins to organize itself around a point of concern. She set the ledger down. She had run this boarding house for 11 years, since her husband Thomas had died and left her the building and the mortgage and the considerable task of figuring out what to do with both. She had learned, in 11 years of watching people come through a door with their luggage and their histories, that the first impression a town made on a stranger was a mirror. It showed you the town, not the stranger. What she saw in that mirror right now she did not particularly like. She went back to her ledger. She heard the noise from the saloon 20 minutes later. Not shouting, nothing dramatic, just the particular quality of silence that follows a public statement. She already knew what had happened before Sheriff Boyd Carver climbed back up the street with his thumbs in his belt and his expression arranged into the careful neutrality of a man who had done what the room required. The stranger came out of the saloon a few minutes after that. He stood on the steps for a moment, looked up and down the street with the unhurried assessment of someone taking stock rather than planning anything. And then he crossed to his horse. He did not look angry. He did not look wounded. He looked, Martha thought, like a man who had received a piece of information he had been more or less expecting and was now deciding what to do with it. He led his horse toward the livery. He did not look back. Martha was downstairs and behind the front desk when he came to the door of the boarding house 10 minutes later. He took off his hat, a gesture so automatic it was clearly older than any particular room. And he said, "Ma'am, I understand I've got one night. I'd like a room if you have one. I'll pay in advance." She looked at him, up close. The road was written on him more plainly. The particular weathering that comes not from one hard season, but from many of them, accumulated. There was an old scar along his right forearm that had the specific geometry of a man who knew how to take a knife away from someone else. His hands, though, were the hands of a man trained for precision. Careful, still, the hands of someone who was accustomed to doing delicate work in difficult circumstances. His eyes were steady, not calculating, not desperate, just steady and a little careful, and carrying the specific quality of a man who has learned that the first few seconds of conversation often determine everything that comes after. "I have one," Martha said. "Supper's at 6. I don't wait." "Yes, ma'am." She did not know, watching him sign the register in a clean and deliberate hand. Eli Cross, Missoula, that before the next morning came. This man the town had already decided to discard would be the only reason 4 people in that building were still alive. She did not know it, but she gave him the room anyway. Supper at the Gale boarding house was at 6 o'clock, and Martha did not wait. Eli came down the narrow stairs at 5:58 to find a table already set and 3 strangers already seated. A traveling merchant of some kind. Sample cases visible through the open door of the front room. A man whose entire bearing communicated desire to be somewhere else and a resigned acceptance that he was here. A young couple at the far end of the table. The wife saying something quietly that made the husband smile in the private, reflexive way of people who have not yet grown tired of each other. They glanced at Eli when he sat down, and then returned to each other with the smooth indifference of people whose world had recently contracted to a comfortable size. Martha came out of the kitchen with a pot and began serving without ceremony. Beef stew, biscuits, a jug of water on the table. She set everything down with the efficiency of a woman who had done this 10,000 times and had long since stopped finding it remarkable. Then she sat down herself at the head of the table, which seemed to surprise the merchant faintly. He said nothing. Nobody did. Eli ate. The stew was good, better than good, the kind of food that takes time and attention, and a cook who still bothers caring about the result. He noticed this the way he noticed most things, quietly, without comment. The merchant left first, excusing himself with the vague haste of someone with ledgers to attend to. The young couple followed soon after, the wife touching her husband's arm as they went upstairs in a gesture so small and complete it was almost private to witness. And then it was just Eli and Martha, and the sound of the evening settling into the house around them. Martha refilled her coffee. She did not ask if he wanted more. She poured his cup anyway, set the pot down, and looked out the window at the street, which was quiet now in a particular way of a town that has drawn itself inward for the night. "Cold Dre worked the Miller Ranch," she said. Not to Eli specifically. Almost to the window. Good worker by all accounts. Kept to himself. Had the boy to think about, which tends to focus a man. She paused. 6 weeks now, and Boyd Carver hasn't arrested anybody. Hasn't said much of anything, which in a town this size is the same as saying everything. Eli kept his hands around his cup. "People around here have been looking for somewhere to put their worry," Martha said. 6 weeks is a long time to carry something with nowhere to set it down. A pause. "You rode in at the wrong time." He looked at her. "I usually do," he said. She turned from a window then, and looked at him the way she had looked at him across the front desk that afternoon. Directly, without performance. "Where are you coming from?" "Missoula, most recently." He turned his cup in his hands. Before that, Bozeman. Before that, a few places that didn't leave much impression. And before those, the fire moved in the small stove in the corner. Outside, something moved on the street. A horse, a late walker, and then was gone. "The Army," he said. He told it the way a person tells something they've told before, but never easily. Not rehearsed, just worn smooth in certain places from the handling. He had enlisted in 76, posted the frontier as a field medic. He was good at it. That part he did not say with pride exactly, more the flat acknowledgement of a fact. He had a talent for keeping people alive in circumstances that argued against it, and the Army had found that useful for 5 years. Then there had been a skirmish in the fall of 81, a bad one, an afterward group of wounded prisoners. 8 men, none of them dangerous in condition they were in, and a commanding officer who had looked at the supply situation and the distance still to march and made a calculation. The order was to move out and leave them, untreated, in the field. Eli had not moved out. He had stayed through the night with his own kit and done what he knew how to do, which was keep 8 men from dying of wounds that were survivable if someone bothered. By morning, all 8 were alive. By morning, so was the court-martial. Insubordination, he said. Conduct unbecoming. The formal language was thorough. He looked at the table. They weren't wrong about what I did. I did it. I'd do it again. He paused. That was the problem, I think. I wasn't sorry enough for them to work with. Martha had not moved or spoken through any of this. She had the particular stillness of someone who understands that the most useful thing they can offer at a given moment is the absence of interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment longer, as if making sure. So you were punished for doing the right thing, she said. Eli was quiet for a moment. Depends on who you ask. The Army had a point of view. She shook her head once. Slowly. The Army's point of view put you on that road. He didn't answer that. There wasn't much to add to it. Martha set her cup down. Cold Dre left behind a boy, she said. The shift was quiet, almost seamless, one true thing following another. 7 years old. Peter. He's been upstairs since it happened. Only other kin is an Ann in Billings who wrote once and hasn't written since. She looked at the table. Quiet boy. Doesn't eat much. Sits at the window a great deal. Eli said nothing, but his eyes moved upward for a moment, just briefly, just the involuntary direction of a man thinking about someone on the floor directly above him, and then came back down. I'll clear, he said, and began stacking plates. He had noticed something else, and he turned it over as he carried the dishes to the kitchen. On his ride in that afternoon at the edge of the south road where it bent toward the Miller property, he had seen a rider moving away from town at a pace that was not leisurely and not quite urgent. The specific pace of someone who did not want to be clocked, but was managing the urge to hurry. The man's coat had been good quality, his horse better. The brand on the animal's flank had been partially obscured by the angle in the light, but not entirely. Eli had filed it away the way he filed most things. Not because he was looking for anything, but because the medic's habit of observation had never distinguished between what was useful and what wasn't. He noticed everything and sorted it later. He was not looking for trouble. He was leaving in the morning. He said good night to Martha, who was already moving back toward the kitchen with the efficiency of a woman, whose evening was not finished simply because supper was. He climbed the stairs. The hallway at the top was narrow and dark, 2 doors on each side. The second door on the left was closed, and from beneath it came the faint specific silence of a child asleep, or a child lying still in the practiced way of someone who had learned that the dark was safer navigated quietly. Eli stopped. He stood at that door for 3 or 4 seconds, long enough to mean something, short enough that he could not have said precisely what. Then he moved on. His room was at the end of the hall. He set his pack on the floor and laid out what he needed for the morning in the order he would need it, which was the habit of a man who had broken enough cold camps to understand that morning judgment was not always reliable. He sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at his hands, the way he had looked at them 100 times in 100 rooms like this one, in particular way of a person taking inventory of what they still have. The window was open. The night air came in cool and smelling of dry grass and the faint mineral bite of the mountains to the west. There was something else in it, faint as a rumor. He thought it might just be the way Montana smelled in late summer. There was always something of smoke in a dry August night out here, something of the season burning itself out of the edges. He lay back. He closed his eyes. He was almost asleep when the smell got stronger, and then someone in the street below began to shout. The shout came from the street below, and Eli was at the window before he was fully awake. The back half of the boarding house was already going. He could see it from the window. The kitchen curtains first, the way fire always finds fabric, and then the wall behind the stove catch it with a speed that meant the wood was old and the summer had been dry, and the two things together had been waiting for exactly this. The orange light was climbing. The smoke was the thick, low kind that moves like something with intent. He had his boots on in 4 seconds. His coat in 3 more. He left the pack. He left everything. The street was already filling when he hit the front door. People pouring from the saloon, from the houses on either side, drawn by the light and the alarm and the specific human instinct that makes a fire both something to run from and something impossible not to approach. The crowd gathered at the edge of the heat and stopped there, because the heat was a wall now and the building was making sounds. Deep, structural sounds, the groan of the thing being asked to hold together past its ability. And there were sounds from the upper floor, too. A child's voice. More than one. Eli stood at the edge of the crowd and looked at the building. He looked at the people standing still. Sheriff Carver was there, 10 feet away, his face orange in firelight, doing the calculation that the crowd was also doing and arriving at the same paralyzed result. The traveling merchant stood with his hands at his sides, staring upward. Doyle Marsh was at the far edge of the gathering, good coat unmistakable, watching with an expression that gave nothing away. Everyone could see the upper windows. Everyone could hear what was coming from them. Nobody moved. Eli was not thinking about courage. Courage is something you name afterward, from a safe distance. What he was thinking, in the flat and functional way of a man whose training had never fully left him, was front staircase still intact, smoke moving upward and east, first room on the left, second room at the end of the hall. He was doing the arithmetic of how. He turned to the nearest man, a farmhand he did not know, who was standing with his mouth open, and handed him the reins of his gray horse, which had followed him out of the livery in the commotion, and was now pressing its nose against his shoulder with the focused concern of an animal that has opinions about the current situation. The farmhand took the reins without a word, because Eli did not give him time to form one. He walked through the front door. The inside of a burning building does not look the way it looks from the street. From the street, there is spectacle, the light, the drama of it. From inside, there is only work. Heat pressing down from above like a hand. Smoke sitting thick at shoulder height and thicker above that. So you move low without deciding to. The sounds are different too. Not the roar people imagine, but something more intimate, more various. The crackle would under stress. The particular whisper of fire finding a new surface. The building talking to itself in a language that means I am running out of time. He found Agnes Cole in the front room, the closest. She was at her door, which had swollen the heat and wouldn't open from the inside. He broke it with his shoulder and caught her before she went down. She was 72 years old, and she weighed very little, and she held onto his coat with the specific grip of someone who has decided to trust completely or not at all. He got her the front door and handed her to the first pair of arms he saw outside. Then he went back in. The 2 children were on the second floor. The stairs were holding. He took them fast, staying to the left where the smoke was thinner, and found them in the room above the front parlor. A girl of 9 and her brother of 6, the traveling couple's children. The couple themselves somewhere in the crowd outside, having gotten out fast, and then found the stairs impassable when they tried to go back. The girl had the presence of mind to have wet a cloth at the wash basin. She had it pressed over her brother's face. He noted this with the part of his mind that noted things, and said, "You did right," and took the boy on his back and the girl by the hand, and came back down the stairs with the ceiling above them beginning to make a new and more urgent sound. He handed them out and did not stop. The third trip was harder. The smoke was at chest height, now throughout the hall. He moved along the wall to Peter Dre's door, which was closed but not locked. Inside, the room was not yet burning, but the ceiling above it was making sounds that described what was coming. The bed was empty. The window was shut. He got down on the floor where the air was thinner and looked beneath the bed. Peter was pressed against the far wall, knees to chest, eyes open, past the point where shouting would reach him. Eli had seen that before, the specific internal distance a person puts between themselves and a situation they cannot process. You did not hurry someone back from that place. Hurry only drove him further. He put his face near the floor and spoke quietly. "My name is Eli. Martha sent me. A beat. She's outside. She's waiting for you." The boy looked at him. Something moved in his eyes, a small thing, a crack in the distance. "She said to come get you," Eli said, "so that's what I'm doing." Peter Dre crawled out from under the bed. The roof gave as Eli reached the bottom of the stairs. Not all of it, just the back section, the kitchen end, dropping with a sound like a verdict. The front stairs held for the 4 seconds he needed. He came through the front door with the boy against his chest. He set Peter down on the dirt road, crouched in front of him, and checked him the way he had checked men after a field engagement. Hands, face, eyes, the efficiency of someone for whom this was once daily practice. The boy was whole, frightened and whole. Then Eli sat down in the dirt because his legs had reached the end of their professional obligation and were now expressing their personal feelings about the last 20 minutes. The crowd was silent, not the silence of indifference, the other kind, the silence of people confronting something that has rearranged their understanding. The man they had decided about before he reached the hitching post was sitting in the dirt in front of them, covered in smoke, checking a child's hands for burns with the careful attention of someone who finds this more important than anything else currently happening. Martha pushed through and crouched beside Peter. She looked at the boy first, then at Eli. She did not say anything. She did not need to. It was someone near the back of the crowd who said it, an older woman, her voice carrying the strange quiet. "That's Cole Dre's boy." The name moved through the crowd the way names do when they carry weight. People looked at each other. They looked at the child. They looked at the man sitting in the dirt. The arithmetic was not complicated, but it landed hard. The man they had tried to run out of town had just saved the child of town had failed twice already, once in a ditch on the Miller Road 6 weeks ago, and once tonight when the crowd had stood at the edge of the heat and done the calculation and arrived at nothing. Nobody spoke. Sheriff Boyd Carver stood at the edge of the crowd with the firelight on his face, and something shifted in him that was visible from 10 feet away. Not guilt precisely, but the look of a man whose careful management of the situation has just become something he will have to answer for. At the far edge of the gathering, Doyle Marsh turned and walked back toward the dark. Slowly, deliberately, with the specific composure of a man who has somewhere to be that has nothing to do with any of this. Eli watched him go. He said nothing. He filed it away. Then he looked back at Peter Dre, who was looking at it with the careful, uncertain attention of a child still deciding, and Eli stayed where he was, in the dirt at eye level, and waited for the boy to finish making up his mind. By the time the sky began to think about morning, the fire was out and the bucket line had dissolved back into the people it had been made of, and Eli Cross was sitting on the steps of the general store with a cup of coffee Martha had brought him without asking whether he wanted it. The boarding house stood the way a thing stands when it has lost an argument with itself. The front intact, the back half open to the sky, the line between the two as clean and final as a decision. The smell of it was everywhere. It would be for days. Eli had learned, in places that burned for different reasons, that smoke had a longer memory than most people gave it credit for. His horse was still at the livery. He had not ridden out. He was not entirely sure why. He watched the sky move through its colors, the black first, then the particular deep blue that comes just before gray, then the gray itself, and then, slowly, the pale gold that Montana mornings produce in late summer, as though the land is reminding itself what it's capable of. He drank his coffee. He did not think about anything specific. Sometimes after a long night, the mind earns the right to simply observe. Boyd Carver found him there before the town was properly awake. The sheriff looked like a man who had spent the night in conversation with himself and come out the worse for it. He sat down on the step below Eli without being invited, which Eli noted without comment, and he held his hat in his hands and looked at the ruined back of the boarding house for a moment before he spoke. He told it plainly, which Eli respected. No preamble, no management of the shape of it. The cattle thefts traced to Doyle Marsh. Had for weeks, probably longer. The brands, the timing, the direction the stolen animals moved. It had pointed the same way for long enough that not seeing it had required a specific kind of effort. The Marsh family had roots in this valley that went down 20 years, and a lawyer in Billings who had, on 2 previous occasions, made life significantly difficult for people who had caused a family inconvenience. "So you let it sit," Eli said, not an accusation, just the shape of what had happened. "I let it sit," Carver said. He did not offer anything further in his own defense, which was its own kind of honesty. Eli drank his coffee. "Last night rearranged some things," Carver said quietly, "about what a man owes a town, and what a town owes a man." He looked at his hat. "I'm riding to the Marsh property this morning. I have a deputy." A silence sat between them, not uncomfortable, just full, the silence of 2 men on the far side of a long night who have run out of things to perform for each other. "That boy," Eli said finally. Carver looked at him. "Peter, someone needs to write to the Ann in Billings. "I'll do it myself," Carver said. "Today." Eli nodded. He looked back at the sky. Carver put his hat on and stood, and for a moment he seemed to be working towards something else, something longer, and then thought better of it and left it where it was. Some things kept better unspoken a little longer. He walked back toward the jail to collect his deputy. Martha came and sat beside Eli 20 minutes later with her own coffee, which she had plainly earned. She looked at the boarding house the way a person looks at something they built, and are calculating how to build again. The front was sound, the parlor, the front rooms, the staircase. The back was sky and ash and the skeleton of what the kitchen had been. It was not nothing. It was also not nothing to fix. "Structure is good from the middle forward," she said. "Back half needs to come down clean before anything goes up." She paused. "I could use someone who knows how to rebuild things." She was not only talking about the building. They both understood this without remarking on it. Eli looked at his coffee. "I'm not much for towns," he said. Martha looked at the street, at the burnt smell of the morning, at the place where the crowd had stood the night before in its frozen and ashamed silence. "Neither was this one," she said, "until last night." Eli had nothing to say to that, because it was accurate and complete and did not require addition. Carver stopped in front of him on his way to his horse. Martha was still beside him on the steps, behind the sheriff, without arrangement, without anyone suggesting it. A small number of people had found reason to be nearby. The livery owner, the young couple whose children were upstairs asleep with lungs full of clean air because of the man on these steps, 3 others whose names Eli did not yet know. Not a ceremony, not a crowd, just people standing in morning light with nowhere specific to be. Carver looked at Eli. "You don't have to go," he said. 5 words, plainly delivered. The sheriff was not a man who dressed things up, and this was not the moment to start. Eli looked at the people standing in the early light. He looked at Martha. He looked at Peter Dre, who had been brought out wrapped in a blanket and was sitting on the far end of the general store steps, watching Eli with the patient, measuring attention of a child who has learned that adults require observation before they can be trusted and is still completing his assessment. Something shifted in Eli's posture, not dramatically. Nothing about this man was dramatic, just a specific, almost architectural change of a person who's been braced for leaving so long that the act of remaining requires a physical adjustment, like a door that has been held closed, finally allowed to sit in its frame. He stood. He walked to his horse at the livery post and untied it. He did not check the saddle for the road. He walked the horse back into the livery and into its stall and hung the bridle on the nail, the way you hang something you will not need this morning. He came back out and stood in front of the boarding house and looked at the burnt-back half with the quiet, measuring eye of a man calculating sequence. What comes down first? What goes up after? How many board feet? How many days before the cold made the work harder than it needed to be? He bent and picked up a piece of scorched wood from the debris, turned it in his hands, felt where the fire had taken it, and where the wood beneath was still sound. Set it down. Some decisions are made in the hands before the mouth catches up. Doyle Marsh was arrested on a Tuesday, quietly, the way real justice usually arrives, without spectacle, without the drama the crime itself had carried. The valley absorbed it the way valleys absorb things, slowly, with the understanding that the land remains regardless of what the people on it do. Peter Dre began eating more at supper, not immediately, gradually, the way appetite returns when safety becomes something a person can provisionally believe in. He started sitting at the table instead of the window. He started watching Eli the way he had watched him on the steps that first morning, carefully, with the open assessment of a child who has decided to take his time and means it. The aunt from Billings wrote back in September. She was coming, she said. It would be a few weeks. In the meantime, Martha was managing, and Eli was there, and Peter had apparently appointed himself assistant to whoever was rebuilding the back of the boarding house, which mostly meant handing things up and asking questions about with grain and load-bearing walls that were more considered than most adults would have expected. The back of the boarding house went up through September, board by board, in a particular rhythm of work that has a clear shape and a foreseeable end. Eli's hands found their purpose in it. Not a field hospital, not the frontier, not any of the provisional arrangements of the past 3 years, but something that would stand through winter and after and beyond that. something that needed him to care about whether it lasted. On a Thursday evening in October, with the light going orange over the Bitterroot Range and the air beginning to carry the first serious intention of cold, Boyd Carver stopped by the building site and stood watching Eli work for a while. Martha was below, passing up lumber. Peter was on the fence rail with his chin in his hands, observing everything with great seriousness. Carver watched for a while without speaking, which was his way. Then, without looking up at Eli, he said, "I'm sorry, we almost made a mistake." Eli drove a nail. Let the sound of it finish. "Almost," he said. Carver nodded. He put his hat on and walked back toward the street. That was enough. That was, in the end, exactly enough. You don't always know the moment when the drifting ends. Sometimes you only know it looking back, at a gray horse tied in a livery, at a scorched piecewood turned in steady hands, at a boy on a fence rail watching a man he has decided, finally, to trust. Sometimes it ends not with a choice you can name, but with a morning you don't leave, and another after that, and the slow accumulation of days that add up to something you would call, if someone asked, home. But it ends, and that was the story of Eli Cross, a drifter who had stopped believing he belonged anywhere, until a town that didn't want him gave him a reason to stay. Sometimes the place that needs you most is the last place that deserves you. If you enjoyed the story, kindly like, comment, and share to your friends. Also subscribe to enjoy more stories like this. Thank you for watching.